Hello scary ramblers, and guess what, it's that time again. It's Macanori time and we are coming to the end of Tales from a Scary Girl. I've got two more stories to tell you. The first of these should I say, is probably the longest short story I've ever written. Well, it was at the time anyway, and there had been that intention that I would turn this into something longer, but it never quite got that far. Sometimes stories are the length they're meant to be when you write them the first time, so sometimes they're not, so it all depends. But this story is one of the first stories I ever wrote. It's very dear to my heart, and it's called The Creature Within. John's eyes were wild. He could feel the panic escalating through his body, could hear his heart hammering against his ribcage. Must go faster, he chanted as he pumped his legs faster and faster, his breathing becoming shallower as he gulped the chill night air into his screaming lungs. What the hell had possessed him to come running in the park? Why couldn't he just train with the team like everybody else? He shuddered, angry with himself. His stupid ego, that's why. Before the accident, he'd been the best basketball player the college team had, and now look at him, struggling to run a couple of miles through the park. John could see the row of houses on the other side of the railings, lit up like lighthouses against the intense blackness of the night. Come on, damn it, faster, he urged himself, wishing he was in the midst of another one of his parents' arguments, wishing he was anywhere but here. He stumbled on the uneven ground, his left ankle giving out under the strain. No, he screamed, throwing out his arms to try to break his fall. John hit the ground hard, the pain in his newly mended ankle shooting warning signals to his brain. Got to get up, nearly there, nearly home, he muttered, drifting in and out of consciousness, the pain from his ankle causing waves of nausea to rack his body. Just then he heard it, and lucidity returned. Panic began to overwhelm him again, flooding his limbs with the adrenaline he needed. Pushing himself up, he bit down on his lip and winced as he leaned on his damaged ankle. The pain was excruciating, but he had to move. He had no choice. The gap in the railings wasn't far, and then he would be home. John heard it again, the unearthly howling that had plagued him during his run through the park. At first he thought it was one of the animals from Chekhov's circus, but he'd passed their cages a while back, and the howling was just as clear now as it had been then. Something was following him, he was sure of it. He couldn't see anything, but the hairs on the back of his neck had been on alert for a while, and goosebumps were running rampant across his skin. Something was definitely watching him. Limping as fast as he could across the uneven ground, he tried to locate the gap in the railings, the gap that had been there since he was at primary school, the gap they'd all sneaked through into the park after closing time, the gap that was going to save his life. Terror replaced panic as his wild eyes faced a solid line of railings, 8 feet high and topped with barbed wire. Disbelieving, he scoured the length of metal, but did not locate any defects. John dropped to his knees in despair, a sob escaping his throat as he realised his predicament. The creature was getting closer now, having stalked its prey through the park. It was time to move in for the kill. It had tracked him ever since he'd entered the park, his fluorescent covering making him an easy target without the unbearable stench that humans gave off. He'd been too easy in a target, almost not worth the effort, but not quite. It waited in the cover of the trees, watching him slumped over on all fours, his body heaving. It ran a long purple tongue over its razor-sharp teeth, and pointing its nose towards the sky, let out a blood-curdling howl. It was time. John started at the noise and looked around him. He couldn't see anything in the pitch dark. He could hear the trees rustling in the wind, and as he strained to make out the other sounds, he heard the rasping breaths. He squeezed his eyes shut tight, forcing tears to seep out from under his eyelids. He could hear footsteps now, heavy and even. They were circling him. John didn't want to open his eyes. He didn't want to see what was stalking him. He felt the creature draw closer to him. He could smell the dampness of its skin. He could smell the death and decay on its breath. He could feel the warmth of its breath and the wetness of its nose as it stood face to face with him. Keeping his eyes firmly shut, John kept as still as he could, hoping the creature would think him already dead and go away. As if hearing his prayer, the creature did move away from him. Too elated to think straight, John opened his eyes just in time to see the creature as it lunged for him. Its talon-like claws ripped open his abdomen and he felt the contents of his lower body emptying out onto the grass. As the darkness drew in on him, he saw the creature's fangs as it lunged for his neck, tearing his throat wide open. The creature, full and sated, sloped back into the cover of the trees. As it disappeared, the moon emerged from behind the clouds as though it had been hiding, and illuminated the carnage in an eerie glow. It was a full moon. The young man lay 6 feet from the railings, spread-eagled on the grass, his vacant stare reflecting the glow of the moon. His body was turned inside out, his fingers twitching as his life ebbed away. Why did he go running in the park? The question was imprinted in his glassy stare forever. The wind picked up and the branches from a young sapling rose and fell on the currents. The gap in the railings came into view. Ellie awoke as the morning sunshine began to warm her naked body. She stretched and rolled over, feeling for Brad on the grass next to her. Already gone, she mused. What a chicken. She sat up and looked towards the back of her parents' house. Their curtains were still drawn, which was a good sign. They would not be impressed if they found her like this. She giggled to herself as she scrabbled around for the clothes she had been wearing the previous night. Where on earth had she put them? She sat up and looked around, shielding her eyes from the harsh light of the dawning sun. Where the hell were her clothes? Brad must have taken them, she thought. She'd get him back. She jumped up and headed for the back door. Luckily, her parents still believed her when she said she wouldn't be home late and had left the door unlocked. She closed it behind her and listened for any movements from upstairs. Nothing. As quickly as she could, Ellie scampered upstairs into the safety of her room, collapsing onto the bed, her heart pounding. She smiled to herself as she thought about the previous night. Brad was such a thoughtful lover, and wild. Her body still tingled from what he had done to her. Afterwards, they smoked some pot, or rather a lot of pot. And then things had become a bit hazy. What had happened after that? Shrugging her slender shoulders, Ellie padded into her bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. Something must have happened, she mused as she plucked leaves out of her thick wavy hair, because these certainly didn't grow in her father's garden. Humming to herself, she perched on the edge of the bath and turned on the taps. She poured in a capful of her favourite jasmine-scented bath oil and began swirling the now cloudy water. Her thoughts returned to Brad, all 6 feet 4 inches of dark good looks and mystery. As usual, her father had not been impressed. "He's a mechanic, Ellie," her father had said. "What future can he possibly have? Why isn't he at university with the other kids his age?" Who cares, thought Ellie, her mind full of the previous night and of Brad's strong arms and toned torso and... Ah! Ellie screamed and doubled over in pain as the first waves of cramps overtook her body. She hit the floor with a thud as she fainted, the sound of the running water fading away as she slipped into darkness. Barbara Parker awoke with a start as she heard her daughter's screams. She jumped out of bed, knocking Nostradamus from his comfy perch. The grey cat growled in disgust and stalked out of the room as Barbara raced into her daughter's room. "Ellie, where are you, sweetheart?" Pushing open the bathroom door, she saw Ellie slumped on the floor, her athletic body convulsing as the waves of cramps surged through her. "Oh my God!" Barbara turned off the taps and, grabbing a towel, she dropped to the floor and wrapped it around her daughter. Hugging Ellie to her, Barbara began to rock her back and forth, whispering her name, urging her to come round. As tears coursed down her pale cheeks, she absently traced the jagged scar on her daughter's limp left forearm. Barbara leant back against the bath, a lock of her dark hair falling across her face, and closed her eyes. "Bar, what's going on?" Jack asked as he rubbed his eyes, trying his best to wake up. "What does it look like, Jack?" she said. "It's the time of the month again, and look at her!" A sob escaped her throat as her green eyes rested on her unconscious daughter. "There's nothing we can do, Bar. The doctors have said it's just her body's way of dealing with it." "Jack, there is nothing natural about the onset of her period. I mean, look at her. This is not what should happen." "I know, honey, but what else can we do?" Jack left the question hanging in the air as he went downstairs to start his day with coffee and the Saturday Financial Press. Barbara felt Ellie flinch and realised she'd been taking her annoyance with her husband out on Ellie's scar, which was now red raw. That was odd. After all these years, it shouldn't still hurt her. Barbara thought back to the day Ellie got the scar. They'd had an Alsatian, Greco, who Ellie had been nursing back to health after he'd been attacked by a wild animal. The dog had been really sick, and Ellie had been insistent that he should stay with her while he recovered. One night while she slept, the dog had turned on her and had torn a chunk out of her arm. Jack had had to subdue Greco with a baseball bat, and they'd had to have him put down after that. Ellie had never really gotten over it. "That's why we decided to get you, isn't it, Damus?" Barbara said to the cat sitting in the bathroom doorway, his orange eyes fixed firmly on Ellie's inert body. At the sound of her mother's voice, Ellie began to stir, and the cat, hackles raised, started hissing and spitting at her. "Damus, what's wrong with you? Get out of here!" Barbara shooed him away as she helped Ellie to sit up. "How are you feeling, baby?" Barbara said. She swept a lock of sand-coloured hair behind Ellie's ear. "Like I've been run over by a train," Ellie said, managing a small smile. "I think I'll salvage my bath and soak in it for a while." "Okay, sweetie, I'll go and start breakfast." As Barbara left the bathroom, Ellie hauled herself back up onto the side of the bath and turned the hot tap back on. Nostradamus sat watching her from the doorway. "Come here, Damus," Ellie said. Damus just hissed at her and disappeared. "Stupid cat," she muttered. "What was wrong with him just lately?" Too exhausted to care, she slipped into the exotic scented steam, gritting her teeth against the hot pokers now stabbing every part of her body. Submerged up to her neck in the oil-laden water, she rested her head against the soft pillow that spent its life suctioned to one end of the bath. She began to relax as the hot water worked its magic, soothing the pains away. Ellie closed her eyes and let herself drift away. She was with Brad. They were holding hands and laughing together as they strolled through the park. The moon was full, but the night was cloudy, and so they walked mainly in darkness. Brad began walking faster and faster, dragging her behind him until they were running flat out. He pulled her through the trees, her long hair snagging on the low branches. She wasn't laughing anymore. She was crying. Brad looked back at her and grinned, before letting go of her hand and racing off into the woods. She stood, frozen to the spot, as she heard the blood-curdling howl and saw the flash of white teeth and blood-red eyes. Ellie awoke with a start, her heart pounding. Where the hell had that come from? She shivered, not sure whether it was because of the dream or because the water had cooled considerably. Climbing out of the bath, she wrapped herself in a thick, fluffy towel. She padded back into her bedroom and sat down at the dressing table and looked at herself in the mirror. The cramps had certainly taken their toll. Her sapphire eyes lacked their usual shine, and her rosy cheeks looked grey and hollow. As she picked up her hairbrush, Ellie could hear her parents downstairs talking about her. They weren't shouting, they were just talking, but she could hear them clearly. "There's something wrong with her, Jack, there must be. Oh, for God's sake, Bar, I'm not going over this again. We're just going to have to live with it. The doctor said it would get easier for her as she gets older. They said it's always harder for late developers, and let's face it, she was 17 before any of this started." "I know that, Jack, and she's only 18 now. What's she going to be like in 10 years? These episodes are getting worse and the blackouts longer. She's changing, Jack. She's not Ellie. She's not the Ellie she used to be. She's moody, she's erratic, she's aggressive, and even Damus doesn't seem too fond of her anymore. They used to be inseparable. Oh, come on, Barbara, she's growing up, that's all. As for Damus, he's just jealous of Brad. He's only been acting odd since she started seeing him," Jack said. "Yes, but that's not all. That scar on Ellie's arm, it's all raw again and she flinched when I touched it. Honey, that's just psychological. Greco meant a lot to her. She was unconscious at the time." Unsure what to say, Jack returned to his newspaper. Damus, who was munching happily on his breakfast, hissed as Ellie entered the kitchen and disappeared through his cat flap into the garden. Ellie was dressed in jeans, a white t-shirt and trainers, her sandy-coloured hair pulled back in a ponytail. She had carefully applied her makeup to disguise her pallor so as not to worry her parents. "I'm going to Brad," she said, as she plucked a piece of toast from the pile on the table. "Aren't you going to have a proper breakfast first, sweetie?" "It'll make you feel better," Barbara said. "I'm okay, Mum. I'll get something later." "Are you sure you should be going out to see him after what happened this morning? Maybe you should go and lie down for a while." "Maybe you should mind your own business," Ellie snarled, her white teeth flashing in the sunlight. "Eleanor Parker, don't you?" Jack started to say, but she was gone. What the hell was wrong with her? Ellie wondered as she jogged away from her house before her father followed, slowing to a walk at the end of the street. She scratched her left arm and winced. Looking down, she saw her 10-year-old scar, as raw as the day she was stitched up, and sore as hell. A growl erupted from inside her as she touched the wound. Startled, she looked around her, wondering where it had come from, but she was alone in the street. Puzzled, she shrugged her shoulders and headed to Brad's. It was about 11 o'clock when she got there, and standing on the doorstep in the midst of the overgrown garden, she knocked on the green front door, the paint flaking off under the pressure of her knuckles. She waited for 5 minutes, knowing Brad's mum, Jan, would have heard her and would be pulling her dressing gown on, annoyed at having her sleep interrupted. Jan worked 2 jobs and still earned barely enough to feed her 3 kids. Brad helped out, but Jan wanted him to start saving for a place of his own, for a future. "Oh, hey, Ellie," Jan said as she opened the door, wincing at the brightness of the sunshine. "Oh, hi, Jan. I'm sorry to wake you. Is Brad in?" Ellie said, feeling guilty for having deprived Jan of some well-needed rest. "I'm sorry, Elle, but he's gone to one of his biker meets. Didn't he tell you?" "I thought he always told you," Jan said, trying her best to stifle a yawn. Yeah, he usually does," Ellie said. "Due back Monday, isn't he?" "Yep. Look, I don't mean to be rude, but I kind of need to get some sleep. I'm on at 2. I'll see you soon, yeah, Elle?" With that, she closed the door. "Yeah, bye," Ellie muttered to the closed door. Bloody motorbikes, Ellie thought. Why hadn't he told her? As she kicked the gatepost on her way out, a chunk of concrete broke away at the force, but she didn't notice. Brad had been a member of a biker gang, the Vipers, ever since he was 16. They went away every month for a few days to these meets, which were held at various places around the country. "We just talk about bikes and stuff," he'd said when she'd asked about them. Why then, if that's all they did new members have to go through the initiation ceremony, wrestling wild dogs and drinking animal blood? Ellie wondered, not for the first time. It bothered her that he hadn't told her he was going, or maybe he had, but she'd been too stoned to remember. That was it. It had to be. With her black mood starting to lift, Ellie stopped and took stock of her surroundings. She was outside the park. Curious as to know why she'd walked here, she decided to carry on into the park. Why had she come? Maybe she and Brad had arranged to meet here, but why, when he knew he was going to be away? Tired and disappointed at not being able to see Brad, Ellie found a sheltered spot of grass out of sight from the path and sat down. Staring intently into the undergrowth, Ellie swore something was looking back at her. She shook her head, chastising herself for her paranoia, and lay back. As the midday sun warmed her body, she drifted off to sleep. When she awoke, she was disorientated, and it took a few minutes for her to remember where she was. It was dusk now. Ellie shivered as the cool evening breeze caused goosebumps to pattern her bare arms. Rubbing her hands up and down her arms to warm them up, Ellie sat up and stretched, looking at her watch. It was 7:30. God, she must have been tired. Ellie stood up, deciding to go for a walk before she went home. She and Brad came to the park quite a lot. They liked to watch the sun go down over the lake, and this was where she headed. She walked along the slatted jetty to the end and stared out across the lake. The sky was a burnt orange, the final glow of the setting sun lighting the horizon up like fire. The warmth of the air cooled as it touched the lake, creating a mist that hovered just above the surface. With the orange sky fading fast to pale yellow, Ellie sat down cross-legged on the edge of the jetty to watch the final lights of the day fade away. She closed her eyes and leaned back on her elbows, allowing the evening breeze to caress her skin, soothing her. She turned her face to capture the last tendrils of sunlight and picked up his scent. Goosebumps erupted across her flesh once again. She lay back and stretched her arms over her head, reaching towards him. She felt the boards of the jetty vibrate under his weight as he made his way towards her, and she smiled, wicked thoughts jumping into her mind. No one was around. No one would see them, she thought, and shuddered as a ripple of pleasure suffused her abdomen. She started to peel off her clothes, desire flooding her body as she thought of him, thought of them, the previous night. As her mind replayed events, her fingers began to trace the curves of her body, her nails now elongated and sharp, tearing trails through her flesh as she did so. She could feel him drawing near her. She could hear his heavy, rasping breath. Ellie growled with pleasure. His cool nose touched her face and she opened her eyes and looked straight into blood-red ones. Ellie jumped and tried to scream, but all that emerged was a deep, guttural growl. Terrified, she scrambled over onto all fours and tried to stand up, but she couldn't. Her spine wouldn't allow it. As she struggled to stand, tears brimming her eyes, she fell back on her haunches and found herself face to face with it. The creature took a step towards her. but she shrank away, her eyes wild and afraid. It continued to move towards her, its red eyes shining and its jet-black fur almost silvery in the glow from the newly risen moon. Panicked, Ellie jumped as far as she could into the lake and swam towards the shore. Hauling herself up onto the bank, she turned and looked back at the jetty, but the creature was gone. Afraid it was coming for her, she again tried to stand up, but she couldn't. She finally looked down, and in the light cast by the moon, Ellie stared in horror at the thick golden fur that covered her. Terrified, she clawed at her body, desperate to rid herself of it, but she only succeeded in cutting herself with her sharp claws. The rich smell of blood invaded her nostrils and awoke her senses. She felt her stomach rumble and her mouth begin to water, her hunger suddenly urgent and intoxicating. Ellie stared at the wounds on her stomach, and to her disgust felt herself start to lick them clean. Suddenly, she froze. The creature had found her. She could sense it. The familiar smell, the scent that she thought only Brad carried. She wheeled around and stared at the creature before her. Her eyes blazing and her teeth bared, Ellie launched herself towards it, but changed direction at the last minute and disappeared into the trees. She didn't look back this time. She just ran, tears streaming through the damp fur on her face. She ran as fast as she could. She didn't know where. She just ran. Her breath was rasping now, her lungs screaming, but she didn't care. All she could think about was getting as far away as possible. All of a sudden, the ground vanished from beneath her feet, and she felt herself falling. She reached out to grab anything that would break her fall, but there was nothing within reach. She hit the ground with a thud. As Ellie lost consciousness, she caught sight of a pair of red eyes looking down at her from the top of the slope she'd just fallen down. Ellie screwed her eyes up tight against the glaring sunlight, and shielding them, she tried to sit up, but the pain shooting through her head forced her to lie back down. "Oh," she groaned. "Ellie, you okay?" "Brad, is that you? What are you doing here? I thought you were away. Where am I? Where are my clothes? Brad, what the hell's going on?" Ellie started to sob, her headache making her feel sick. "You don't remember what happened last night?" Brad said, running his fingers through her hair. "No, it must have been all that weed you gave me," Ellie said, trying to sit up. She winced as the stabbing pains in her head and groped around for her clothes. "That wasn't last night, Elle. That was the night before. You were in the park last night. You're still in the park? You fell? Don't you remember?" He handed her the clothes he had retrieved from the jetty, and she quickly put them on. What are you talking about?" she said, turning to face him. "Come on, Elle, you must remember. You were on the jetty, naked, waiting for me, or at least I hope you were waiting for me. But when you saw me, you took off." "What? I don't—" "Oh my God," Ellie said, and stared at him in horror. "That was you?" "But I thought I dreamt it, especially me, covered in fur." Ellie trailed off as she stared into his eyes. They were the same eyes she'd looked into last night, except they were tawny now, not red. She started to cry, and Brad sat down next to her and hugged her to him, his raven head bent against her sandy one. "But I don't understand," she sobbed, her mind reeling as she tried to make sense of it all. "I didn't think creatures like that actually existed, Brad. I've heard the tales, but I thought—" "I know, baby, I know," Brad said, kissing her hair. "But how, Brad? You? Me? How? Deep down, I think you know about me. The vipers, the initiation. They were werewolves. They were the people who befriended me, and they were different. We go away for a few days around the full moon, as far away from our families as we can. But why not this time? Because of you. I knew you were one of us, Elle. I could feel it. Then you told me about Greco, and it all fell into place. Then why is it taking so long? Why wasn't I a werewolf when it happened? You don't change until you reach maturity. For you, it only happened recently. Haven't you noticed yourself changing, Elle?" Ellie sat there, her head resting against Brad's chest, his arms wrapped around her, protecting her, making her feel safe. She stared out over the mass of trees spread out around them and listened to the birds singing, to the animals scurrying around in the undergrowth, and to the conversations going on elsewhere in the park. Conversations she wouldn't have been able to hear a few short months ago. It all made sense now, in a weird kind of way. Her erratic behaviour, her amazing hearing, the soreness of her scar, and most of all, Damas's changing behaviour towards her. She shook her head in disbelief. "Are you okay?" Brad said, his voice tinged with concern. "I just don't know what to say. I mean, What happens now? What do I tell my parents? Ellie said, a sob catching in her throat. Hey, don't cry, baby, don't cry. I'll look after you. Ellie closed her eyes and tried to believe in Brad. What choice did she have? He was the only one who understood her now. They stayed like that all afternoon, each lost in their own thoughts, each waiting for something. As the sun began to set, ready for the last full moon of the cycle, Ellie could feel her body changing. Her fear had been replaced with amazement as she watched the golden fur spread across her body, as she watched her nails elongate and curl into the talons she had stared at in horror the night before. She caught her breath as her body was flung forward and her spine arched, forcing her onto all fours. As she felt her teeth growing and her face changing shape, she stared up at the moon. Ellie watched as Brad disappeared into the trees, but she didn't follow, not yet. She sat still for a while, the moonlight glinting off the golden fur that now covered her body. She looked down at the talons that were her nails, and raising her long snout to the moon, she let out a howl that would make your blood run cold. She then loped after Brad. On the other side of the park, a young couple started at the sound. They sat still, listening intently. It's just one of the circus animals, Paul said to Emma. Come on, relax. Emma started to giggle as he tickled her, and they fell back into the grass. A short distance away, in the darkness of the trees, 2 pairs of red eyes watched, and 2 purple tongues ran along 2 sets of razor-sharp fangs. The hunt was on, but tonight he wouldn't be alone. So there we go. So that was The Creature Within. I do apologise for my coughing fit halfway through. I got a bit of a tickle in my throat, but these things do happen to us storytellers. So as I said, that was the second to last story in Tales from a Scary Girl. And tune in next time to hear the very last in my collection of 12 short stories. Take care until then. Bye-bye.